Where does philosophy begin and end? Does it have borders or boundaries? In asking this, we're really asking not just about philosophy itself, but about its relationship to an other, to generally some other discipline, some other activity, some other literature, some other commitment and way of living. And there have been a lot of candidates throughout the years. We're going to talk briefly about rhetoric early on in philosophy, religion, science, and history, including philosophy's own history. And, if you read through much philosophy, sooner or later, you're going to run into people who want to make distinctions along these lines and say there's some sort of division, some sort of distinction, some sort of border, some sort of boundary, and on this side lies philosophy. On this side lies the something else. And there's a lot of different ways of construing this. I will point out that just as there is no consensus definition of what philosophy is or could be or should be, there is no absolutely agreed upon distinction. So when you read people saying philosophy is here and theology is here and this is just the way it is, you got to take that with a little grain of salt, and if you look at history, that will help you to some degree contextualize, if not necessarily relativize and entirely throw out, these attempts at providing dividing lines that are hard and fast. And when we see attempts like this, one of the key questions we want to ask right away is, all right, you've got a division that you're making here. What's your criterion for that? Is there a single way of saying what lies on this side, what lies on this side? Is it a complex of different ideas, different distinctions that are overlapping with each other? Well, that's a significant question. Another question that we have to ask is, who's providing these criteria? Did they just pop into our heads? Were they worked out over time? Are they the result of somebody imposing by fiat? Or are they something that every rational person ought to be able to see? That never actually does happen, by the way. Is the distinction and the criteria coming from the side of philosophy? Is philosophy getting to self-define itself in relation to its other? Or is it coming from the other side, and philosophy takes those cues from the other discipline or activity or literature and says, okay, I'll accept what you have to say? Or is it kind of a mixture of both? And then we can ask another key question. Is the relationship between philosophy and this other discipline supposed to be neutral? Is it cooperative? Is it antagonistic? Is it a case of subordination and superordination where maybe philosophy stands above that discipline and tells it what to do, or where philosophy takes its cues, or should take its cues, from that other discipline or set of disciplines or activity? Well, these are all important questions, and these are all part of the picture whenever anybody invokes something like, you got philosophy and then you got theology, and it's really easy to tell the difference between the two of them. When Thomas Aquinas brings up the Bible, he's doing theology. When he's bringing up Aristotle, he's doing philosophy. You can say, well, what's your warrant? What's your evidence? What's your assurance? What's your argument for using that criterion? Who told you that was right? Right? That's a good, valid question to ask. And that is a philosophical question. So philosophy, once it starts to think about itself, is always involved in meta-philosophical questions about its relation to other things. Let's talk about a few of these, right? So early on, if we think about Plato, and there's also, similar relationship and discussion going on in Aristotle, in Cicero, in others. Philosophy gets counterposed to rhetoric. And often rhetoric gets lumped under sophistry, right? And the sophists were these people who wandered around claiming to teach a variety of different things. Many of them were older or contemporaries of Socrates. Some of them only claimed to teach rhetoric, like Gorgias. Some of them claimed to teach all sorts of other things as well. And philosophy is supposed to be something better than that. Philosophy is supposed to get us to real wisdom, whereas the sophists just have a pretense of wisdom. There's a line being drawn, right? And who gets to draw that line? Well, it's the philosophers, and we should be a little bit, leery sometimes about being too uncritically accepting about what Plato has to say, given that his own student, Aristotle, thought that it was important to write a book called The Art of Rhetoric, and in that book argues that in Book 3 of The Art of Rhetoric, that rhetoric is very important because all teaching involves some persuasion, attending to the audience. Rhetoric could be done in a way that was more informed by philosophy, had a less antagonistic relationship with it. Interestingly, at the same time that Aristotle is teaching, Isocrates, one of the great rhetoricians, has his own school where he's teaching rhetoric in the same place as the same city as Aristotle, and as these people are referencing back and forth. And so there's this long tangled history. Cicero gets involved in it. Later on in the Renaissance and onward, we see other thinkers bringing up the importance of rhetoric for philosophy. We can still make a distinction between them, but perhaps the distinction is less of a strict border and more like several people living in the same house and working with each other and consulting each other from time to time. Another really big one, religion. In Western philosophy, what we're mostly thinking about are the Abrahamic monotheistic faiths of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. But we could apply this to other conceptions of religion. And it's not as if the Greeks and Romans didn't have their own rites, rituals, entire mythologies, and understandings of religion, which varied from time to time. There were philosophical understandings of religion that we find in Plato, in the Stoics, in a variety of other thinkers, going all the way into late Neoplatonism. And quite often this is different than the religion that the ordinary person on the street might be practicing. So already religion is kind of a messy term. Just like philosophy, no strict agreed upon definition of it. But we can say that, at some points, religion and philosophy drew upon each other, and at other points could be quite hostile to each other. What we're interested in is the people that are saying, well, you've got religion on one side, or faith, or theology, or pick whatever other term you want, and then you've got philosophy on the other side. And it might be in terms of the criterion of, this is a purely rational, natural activity. This is a somewhat irrational, informed by revelation activity. And that distinction, you can say, well, again, who gets to make that? Is that a distinction on the side of religion? Is that a distinction on the side of philosophy? When we make these distinctions and we try to see what fits into what side, what do we make of previous thinkers, their literature, their activity, how philosophy is understood as a discipline? Does that mean that we have to push Plato onto the side of religion because he references religious concepts and brings up myths? Socrates himself refers to his daimon. You see how complex and complicated this can get. Another one, science. And here we're talking about in the modern era, and really the late modern era, because philosophy was understood as a science, an episteme, right, or a techne, or a sophia kind of wisdom throughout the ages, a scientia in Latin, and the other sciences, some of them were developing alongside philosophy, like mathematics or medicine. Others came out of philosophy. Physics was part of philosophy. Psychology, part of philosophy originally. Sociology, part of philosophy originally. Even economics, starting out as household management and then eventually becoming political economy. There are all these back and forth things. But nowadays we think of the sciences as being their own sort of thing and having their own scientific method, which they very often don't operate according to the textbook scientific method. It's way more complicated than that. But this became a going concern. How can we separate philosophy off from these sciences like the natural sciences, like the social sciences, all these other things that might figure into it. Some things that maybe they are a science, maybe they aren't, like linguistics, right? Some things involving technology. Is there a nice dividing line that we can draw? Some people thought of philosophy as essentially coordinating all of the other sciences. For example, positivists like Herbert Spencer and Auguste Comte in the 19th century. Others thought that the sciences really ought to be handling the real problems, and then philosophy handles the leftovers, like A.J. Ayer and other logical positivists of that time. And then some people think that there should be fruitful interaction between it. There's even something we call philosophy of science, where we think about what is an experiment? How do we tell whether an experiment was successful or not? Is that part of science or is that part of philosophy? And the verdict is kind of out when it comes to this strict dividing line. Another one that comes up within philosophy has to do with history. Some people practicing or teaching philosophy will say, well, you've got real philosophy over here, and then you've got the history of philosophy over here. And history of philosophy is basically about what other people thought back in the day, and we try to get clear about that. But real philosophy is over here, where we're doing something new, something innovative, something that's leaving behind that history. And then, a lot of people within the history of philosophy say, wow, you've really got it wrong. That's why your philosophy keeps reinventing wheels that, Descartes already handled, or the Stoics already discussed, or Plutarch, who you never read, discussed, right? You're spending a lot of time doing things that you think are new that aren't actually new. Maybe it'd be better to be informed by the history of philosophy. Maybe that's what real philosophizing would consist in. Once again, we see a dividing line being set that people don't really agree upon. So, you notice that I'm saying here as well that narratives and history figure into this. I think personally that having studied, quite a bit within the history of philosophy and the history of ideas is very helpful for realizing that although we can draw lines between philosophy and other disciplines or activities, these lines are typically rather arbitrary. We may have criteria, but we have to ask where those criteria came from. And studying the history of the ideas helps to answer that. We also need to look at the narratives that help us understand why people took these positions. So, for example, why did people say, religion is over here, philosophy is over here? Perhaps one of the narratives is religion is irrational, something that we're going to leave behind, and philosophy will take its place. This is associated with a period that we call the Enlightenment in the West, in which many, many people were working out ideas like that, and they were casting the medieval period as the Dark Ages in which faith ruled and philosophy could not have its full sway. Well, those narratives may be accurate, or they may be self-serving things that function as an ideology for people. So we need to be rather careful about that. This is not to say that we can't make any distinctions whatsoever between philosophy and other activities, disciplines, literatures, but it is to say that we should exercise a little bit of common sense, a little bit of caution, a little bit of judgment, and we should be a bit suspicious about these very neat dividing lines that people would like to make, oftentimes within the philosophical literature, discipline, activity itself.